Chapter 1. The Unexpected Visitor. The hum of the medical bay aboard the research vessel Epsilon 7 was steady, the lights dimmed to a soft glow, only interrupted by the occasional beep of a monitor or the rustling of sterile equipment being moved around. Dr. Julian Foster had been stationed on this lonely asteroid research outpost for what felt like years, far from the hustle of bustling space stations and populated worlds. The routine was monotonous, with little to occupy his time beyond the occasional emergency checkup or monitoring of systems that hadn't needed real repair since the ship had arrived. His time was spent in isolation, doing his best to make sure the systems aboard the Epsilon 7 were running smoothly. His only company the quiet whir of the ship's machinery and the artificial hum of the life support systems that kept him alive in the cold vacuum of space. The ship's crew was small, just a handful of scientists, engineers, and himself, and for the most part, everyone kept to their own routines. But that quiet, predictable life had been shattered the moment the emergency beacon had gone off. He'd heard it loud and clear, waking him from his half-sleep. It was a distress call from a nearby craft. The ship had crash-landed onto the asteroid's surface, and Julian, as the only doctor on board, had been the first one to respond. The rest of the crew scrambled to gather supplies, but Julian had been the one to suit up, head to the hangar, and make his way to the wreckage. When he first saw her, he had no idea what to think. She wasn't anything like the humans he had worked with, studied, or encountered in his medical career. The alien woman had been barely conscious, lying in a crumpled heap in the wreckage of her ship. Her clothes were torn, her skin was slightly charred from the crash, and her arm was badly injured, glued to her side in a way that immediately screamed danger. He hadn't known what to make of it then, and even now, as he sat by her bed, watching her slowly regain consciousness, he found himself staring at her, unable to quite reconcile the reality of the situation. She was nothing like the descriptions of aliens he'd read about, nothing like the ones depicted in science fiction. There were no tentacles, no strange multi-limbed creatures. She looked almost human, except for her unnerving violet eyes that seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the dim light, and the unusual glow to her skin, which didn't look like any human biological trait he'd ever seen. Her body was thin, but muscular, and though her features were sharp, they had a strange kind of elegance to them. It was when she opened her eyes fully and met his gaze that Julian realized how profoundly strange this situation was. Her eyes were intense, glowing with an energy that could only be described as alien. There was intelligence there, sharp, quick, but also something else. Fear, pain. She blinked a few times, slowly, before trying to sit up. Julian immediately stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Easy now," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You're safe. You've been through a crash, and you need to rest." The woman winced, flinching away from his touch as she tried to sit up, but her right arm, which had been sealed to her side with some unknown alien adhesive, refused to move. She didn't seem to be able to raise it at all, and it appeared as though her shoulder had been badly injured. Julian's mind raced as he assessed her injuries. Her arm was glued firmly to her torso, an odd, almost surgical binding that was not unlike a medical adhesive, but far more advanced than anything human technology had produced. It was clear it was doing its job, preventing further movement, and thus possibly preventing more serious damage. But the more Julian looked at it, the more he realized that this was no simple injury. The arm was twisted in a way that made it impossible to remove the glue by human standards. No amount of pressure or tools would dislodge it without causing further damage. And then, she spoke. Her voice, though weak and strained from the crash, still had an undeniable edge to it, something authoritative, something unnervingly calm. "I need you to amputate it," she said, her words clear and cold, as though she were giving a simple order. "What?" Julian's voice faltered, his medical instincts immediately kicking in. He had treated countless injuries in his career, but this was something entirely different. "Amputate? Why?" "It's not dash," she cut him off with a sharp look, her eyes narrowing slightly. There was no emotion there, no panic, no desperation. It was a detached sort of command, one that seemed out of place in such a dire situation. "It's the only way. I don't have time for any other solution. I'll lose too much blood otherwise." Julian blinked in shock. She wasn't just injured, she was a being so certain of her own decisions that she had no hesitation in offering up such a drastic option without so much as a blink. "I'm not going to amputate your arm," Julian said, his voice firm, but also filled with a growing unease. I don't even know what kind of injury you've sustained, or what that glue is. We can figure out another way." "No," she insisted, her gaze unyielding. "You don't understand. You can't understand. I've seen the damage it has done. I can feel it spreading." There was something unsettling in her tone, something desperate in the way her words carried a gravity that made Julian pause. His first instinct as a doctor was to avoid such extreme measures. Amputation was always a last resort. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You're asking me to sever your arm? Just like that? With no attempt to save it?" She nodded, her gaze not leaving his. "Yes. It's necessary. I've been through worse. I will survive." Julian looked at her, uncertainty rising in his chest, but there was something in the quiet strength of her that made him stop. Maybe she knew something he didn't. Maybe there was a deeper understanding at play, a knowledge about her own body or her species that Julian couldn't fathom. He glanced at her arm again, noting how stiff and immobile it was, how unnatural it appeared. Perhaps this wasn't just an injury. Perhaps this was something far more significant, something that required drastic measures. But still, he had never been one to give up so easily. And humans, as a rule, didn't give up. Not on each other, not on life. "I'm going to try something first," he said, his voice determined. "I won't amputate your arm unless I absolutely have to, but I'll need you to trust me." She studied him for a long moment, her violet eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't read, but then, she nodded. "You have 1 hour," she said, as though the matter had been decided, but something in her eyes flickered, a hint of uncertainty, a sliver of vulnerability peeking through. Julian turned to gather his instruments, his mind already racing through the possible procedures and tools he could use to free her from the grip of whatever adhesive had been used. He worked with a sense of urgency, not just for the alien woman, but for himself as well. There was no going back from this. If he didn't find a way to remove the arm's restraint, if he didn't succeed in the next hour, he might be forced to amputate after all, something he couldn't even fathom doing. But in the back of his mind, he knew the stakes. There was more to this woman's story than met the eye, and if she could survive whatever unknown force she was fighting, perhaps she could teach him something about survival, too. Julian could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him as he prepared to attempt something none of his training had ever prepared him for. Medical procedures had always been about precision, about following protocols. But this was different. This woman, this alien, was asking him to do something unthinkable, to sever a limb when there were still options left. And the more he considered it, the more it became clear that there were so many unknowns at play. The strange adhesive that had bound her arm to her side was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was almost as though it had fused with her skin, not simply a substance holding her arm in place, but something that was both medical and alien. He'd examined it briefly when she was unconscious. There were no visible wounds, no tears in her skin. The glue-like substance appeared to have sealed her injury, but was it helping or making it worse? And why had she seemed so sure that amputation was the only option? He ran a hand through his hair, still trying to figure out what had happened. He needed to act quickly. The situation was dire, and the hours slipping away were doing nothing but increasing the risk of permanent damage to her arm. She had said she would lose too much blood if they didn't do something. If the injury was as serious as she suggested, there was no time for second-guessing. Still, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on beneath the surface. He had to try. If he didn't, if the situation turned into an emergency, he would be forced to make an irreversible decision. He began to prepare the medical tools, his hands moving automatically, though his mind was consumed with doubt. There were specialized tools for removing adhesives, for easing pain, for treating alien injuries, things he had read about in journals, things he had seen in theoretical training. But no real experience had ever prepared him for this. His gaze flicked over to her again, the alien woman lying quietly in the medical bed, her eyes flickering with something between exhaustion and expectation. She was waiting, and in some way, he could tell she had already resigned herself to the possibility of losing her arm. She was no stranger to sacrifice. Julian wasn't sure what had brought her to this point. Was she used to seeing herself as expendable? Or was there something more urgent, something that she felt deeply in her bones? Either way, her calm demeanor was almost unnerving. It was as though she had seen far worse, far more dire situations than this one, and had learned to accept them without hesitation. "You're sure about this?" Julian asked, his voice quieter now, a lingering doubt in his mind. The woman's eyes flickered toward him again, and for a moment, There was a flicker of something, perhaps hesitation, perhaps a moment of shared doubt, but it vanished almost as quickly as it came. She nodded, slowly, then spoke, her voice firm despite the weakness in her body. Yes, it's necessary. You can try to save it, but I am telling you that I can feel it. The infection, the spread of damage. If you don't act now, you will only make it worse. Her voice carried a finality that left little room for argument. She was speaking from a place of knowledge, a place of experience that Julian could never access, no matter how many books he had read or how many alien species he had studied in his career. It was in that moment, as he stood over her and watched her carefully, that Julian realized just how out of his depth he was. And yet, there was still a part of him, the part that had taken an oath as a doctor, that refused to accept the easy way out. Amputation was never the first choice. Never. He adjusted the settings on the equipment and prepared the instruments for what he hoped would be a less drastic solution. He would try to dissolve the glue, work slowly to minimize damage, and see if he could restore mobility to her arm without resorting to cutting it off. He would have to be precise, careful, and above all, he had to stay calm. The pressure weighed on him, but there was also a sense of duty he couldn't ignore. This woman had trusted him with her life, and he was damned if he was going to fail her. Her arm was still pressed firmly to her side, and as he took a closer look, Julian realized how much of a delicate operation it was going to be. The adhesive was unlike any glue he had encountered in his career. It was more like a biosynthetic substance, merging with the skin in a way that would make it almost impossible to separate without causing severe injury. Julian's mind raced through all the possible ways to deal with this. The removal method wasn't as simple as he had hoped, but the woman seemed certain. She had already decided her fate, but it was clear to him now that there was something more going on. This wasn't just about a physical injury, it was about survival. "Let's begin," he said softly, his voice steady despite the panic threatening to rise in his chest. As Julian began the procedure, he could feel her eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to succeed. And as he carefully worked to dissolve the adhesive, her hand, her once glued arm, slowly began to move. Chapter 2. The Alien Truth. The moment Julian successfully loosened the grip of the strange adhesive, his heart skipped a beat. It was as though a barrier had been lifted, not just in terms of the arm, but in terms of their unspoken connection. The woman's arm, which had seemed like a permanent fixture, now moved under its own power. Slowly, cautiously, she raised it, her fingers flexing with surprising delicacy. Julian let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But before he could say anything, she spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "You've done it," she said, though there was no surprise in her tone, only quiet acknowledgement. "You're more capable than I thought." Julian looked up at her, still taking in the strange serenity in her eyes. For someone who had just survived a crash landing, endured what looked like severe trauma, and had undergone a complex medical procedure, she seemed unervingly calm. And yet, Julian couldn't help but notice the glimmer of something darker beneath the surface. She wasn't just a casualty of an accident. There was something else. Something she wasn't telling him. "Who are you?" Julian asked, his voice filled with curiosity now that the immediate danger had passed. "What happened to you? To your ship?" The woman hesitated for a moment, her violet eyes flickering away as if she were considering whether or not to reveal the truth. "My name is Elira," she began slowly. "I am from the planet Lauren. We were on a diplomatic mission when something went wrong. We encountered a dangerous entity in the far reaches of the galaxy, an energy force that has been disrupting trade routes, causing massive damage to ships and colonies. Our vessel was attacked. I was the only one who made it out alive." Julian's mind raced as she spoke, piecing together the fragments of information. A diplomatic mission? An alien force attacking ships? It sounded like something out of a nightmare, but it was clear that this woman had been involved in something much larger than just a crash. "You said there was an infection," Julian pressed. "What exactly are you talking about? What happened to your arm?" Elira's gaze turned somber, and for the first time, a crack appeared in her otherwise composed demeanor. "It's not an infection," she corrected him, her voice filled with a dark undertone. "It's a parasite. The entity that attacked us, it has the ability to attach itself to a living host, invade their body, and control it. It's only a matter of time before I succumb to it. That's why I had to cut my arm off so it couldn't spread further." The revelation hit Julian like a slap to the face. A parasite? Something capable of taking control of a living being? He had read about alien life forms, about parasites that could infect their hosts. But this was unlike anything he had encountered before. He had assumed the worst was over. The arm would heal, the woman would recover, and they could move on. But now, the reality was far darker. And the glue? Julian asked, now fully invested in the conversation. What was that? The thing that held your arm down like that? Elira looked down at her arm, flexing it slightly as if testing its strength. That was a form of biotech defense, she explained. It's a barrier that keeps the parasite from spreading further than it already has. It was designed to stop the infection, but only temporarily. It's why I needed you to amputate it earlier. It's the only way to slow the parasite's progression. Julian's heart pounded in his chest as he processed what she was telling him. An alien parasite. A deadly force. And she had just barely escaped with her life. The implications of what she was saying were far-reaching, far beyond the medical procedures he had been trained to perform. This was something different. This was a potential crisis that could affect far more than just one alien woman. I didn't expect this, Julian said quietly, stepping back to examine her once more, his mind still racing. I thought I was just helping you recover. But now, I don't know what's going on. What do you need from me? Elira's eyes met his, her expression still serious. I need your help to stop this. You're my only hope. You're the only one who can help me fight the parasite before it takes over. Julian's mind spun. He had no experience in fighting parasites, no knowledge of how to stop something so alien, so destructive. But one thing was clear, this woman needed him. And for the first time since he had come aboard the Epsilon 7, Julian realized that he wasn't just a doctor. He was a part of something much bigger than himself now. I'll help you, he said, his voice steady with resolve. We'll figure this out. Together. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of the revelation Elira had just shared. Julian's mind raced as he processed everything she had just said. A parasite? A deadly alien force capable of taking over its host's body and mind? And she was just one of its victims, an unfortunate casualty of a war that had nothing to do with her or her mission. His thoughts were scattered, trying to piece together the puzzle, but there was so much he didn't understand. The question he wanted to ask was simple, yet it felt more complicated than anything he had ever encountered in his medical career. How do I stop it? He asked, his voice firm but filled with uncertainty. There was no turning back now. She was looking to him, trusting him to help, and the burden of that trust made his stomach tighten. He wasn't equipped to fight parasites, especially not something as advanced and alien as what she was describing, but he couldn't just abandon her. She had already survived a crash and the terrible force of the parasite's invasion. If she was willing to fight it, he would fight it alongside her. Elira looked at him, her violet eyes studying him with a mixture of appreciation and quiet sadness. You can't stop it completely, not by yourself. But there are ways to slow it down. We need to find out more about its life cycle, its weaknesses, and we need to act fast. The longer it stays within me, the more it takes control. My arm, it was just the beginning. But it won't stop there. It'll spread to other parts of my body. My mind. Her voice dropped, the last words almost a whisper, as if she feared the weight of her own reality. It's a matter of time. Julian swallowed hard. This was more than just a medical emergency. This was an alien invasion, one that had made its way into the depths of her body. What kind of weaponry, what kind of technology could possibly defend against something like this? His scientific mind was beginning to piece things together, but they were only fragments of understanding. What kind of parasite could invade a sentient being's body so completely, without leaving any trace other than a glowing arm? He wasn't sure, but he knew that every second spent debating was a second they didn't have. We'll figure this out, he said, his voice steady, though the knot of fear in his chest tightened with every word. He wasn't sure how, but he had no other choice. Elira needed him, and he couldn't let her down. Her lips curled into a faint, grim smile, but there was something oddly grateful in it. I knew you would. That's why I came here. I wasn't just searching for help, I was searching for someone who wouldn't give up. Julian met her gaze, unsure whether the gravity of her statement was a compliment or a warning. She had come here for him, yes, but she had come to a research outpost on the edge of the galaxy, a place with limited resources and even fewer allies. And now, she was putting her survival into his hands, trusting him to solve a problem that was as much beyond human understanding as it was beyond his medical expertise. He could feel the weight of her eyes on him, but at the same time, he couldn't help but be drawn into the mystery of her. How could someone like her, someone so seemingly fragile, yet carrying such determination, find themselves caught up in something so far beyond their control. And why had she come to him specifically? She was an alien, a being with technology and knowledge he could only dream of understanding. And yet, here they were together, alone in the void of space, trying to survive whatever had come her way. Julian's eyes shifted back to the equipment on the counter. There had to be something, some way to find out more about this parasite. Some tool, some method that could help them. His fingers hovered over the medical scanners, contemplating his next move. I'm going to start by analyzing the glue, the substance used to bind your arm, he said, his mind already formulating a plan. It may hold some clue as to how we can stop the infection. If it's working as a barrier, maybe we can replicate it, extend it to the rest of your body. Perhaps even remove the parasite. Elira's gaze softened as she nodded, as though grateful that he was taking control. I'll leave it to you then, she said, settling back on the bed with a quiet sigh. She closed her eyes, as if bracing herself for the unknown. Julian set to work, scanning her arm once again, this time focusing on the foreign substance that had been applied to it. It was still attached to her skin, but now that the glue had loosened somewhat, he could see that it wasn't a simple adhesive, it was something far more advanced. He tapped a few buttons on the medical station, bringing up a series of diagnostic tests. As the machine whirred to life, he observed the data stream on the screen, trying to make sense of the chemical makeup. His heart skipped a beat when the results started to come through. It wasn't just a biosynthetic glue. This was some kind of alien nanotech. It was designed to work with organic tissue, fusing to it in a way that prevented injury and encouraged healing. But it also seemed to have an inhibitory function. The longer Julian stared at the results, the more it became clear that the parasite wasn't just something in her body, it was interacting with the glue. The substance was acting as both a shield and a trap. The parasite had invaded her body, but the adhesive had prevented it from spreading immediately. This isn't just a medical anomaly, Julian muttered to himself, his mind racing. It's a defense mechanism. The glue was never meant to be permanent, was supposed to slow the parasite long enough for you to get help. Elira's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. She had been quiet, but the moment she saw the look on his face, she immediately knew something had changed. What is it? She asked, a quiet urgency lacing her words. The glue, it's not just stopping the spread. It's acting as a containment unit, Julian explained, glancing over at her. It's holding the parasite in place, preventing it from overtaking your entire system. But it's only temporary. The longer it stays, the worse it will get. We need to figure out how to reverse it, or else it'll spread, and the containment will fail. Elira looked grim, but she said nothing. She had already accepted the consequences. It was Julian who seemed to be feeling the pressure now, more than he ever had before. I'm not giving up, Julian said, his resolve hardening. I'll find a way to remove it, or to stop it from spreading. I promise you that. Elira didn't reply immediately, but when she spoke, there was a quiet gratitude in her voice. I believe you, she said softly, her eyes meeting his with a depth of unspoken understanding. I'll do whatever it takes to help you, Dr. Foster. I know you're not alone in this. I trust you. Her words hit him like a shockwave, leaving him momentarily speechless. She was entrusting her life to him. Her survival depended on his ability to understand an alien force he couldn't even begin to comprehend. But the look in her eyes, the silent plea, the determination, it made him more certain than ever that there was nothing he wouldn't try. He couldn't fail her. Chapter 3. The first step toward hope. The days began to stretch out, and Julian worked tirelessly, running tests, gathering samples, and analyzing every aspect of the parasite and the adhesive that had been used to trap it. Elira, though weakened by her condition, was patient. She lay in the medical bay, keeping her arms still, only speaking when she felt she could offer something useful. She had experience with this parasite. It was clear that she had known the risks when she set out on her mission. The same calm determination that had first caught Julian's attention remained with her now, even as her body grew weaker and her energy diminished. Despite the mounting pressure, Julian refused to give in. He began by isolating the nanotech glue, running experiments to understand its exact properties. Using the advanced medical tools at his disposal, he began testing various methods to neutralize the glue without damaging her tissue. He theorized that if he could reverse its effects temporarily, it might give her enough time to fight the parasite directly, or at least slow it long enough to come up with a more permanent solution. For hours, he worked through the night, finding patterns and inconsistencies in the glue's reaction to various compounds. The more he tested, the more he realized that the nanotech was not just a biological barrier, it was evolving, adapting to his attempts to reverse it. And that's when the full weight of the situation hit him. The parasite, whatever it was, had begun to integrate with the glue itself. It wasn't just a virus. It was far more intelligent than that. As Julian's understanding deepened, he knew that whatever he was dealing with, it was nothing short of a fight for survival, an alien fight with a new enemy. But for Elira and for his own peace of mind, there was no turning back now. They would find a way to save her. Even if it meant diving into uncharted territory. Even if it meant unlocking something beyond human comprehension. And so, with renewed determination, Julian took the first real step towards saving Elira. The race was on. The stakes had never been higher. The ship's medical bay had become Julian's new home over the past few days. It wasn't just the sterile walls and the flickering lights that made it feel like the center of his universe now. No, it was the feeling that everything depended on him, on his ability to break through the mysteries of this alien parasite that had infiltrated Elira's body. Every test, every scan, every failed attempt at neutralizing the nanotech felt like a small setback, but with each one, he learned more. It wasn't enough to stop him, it only fueled his resolve. He could see the quiet suffering in Elira's eyes as the days dragged on. Her arm, now freed from the adhesive, was still showing signs of the parasite's progression. The damage wasn't just physical, it was more profound. Her strength was fading, her energy waning as the unseen force inside her body began to spread, silently taking hold of her with each passing hour. Julian had seen the signs before, though not in a form like this. People who had been infected by parasitic forces before would often show clear signs: skin discoloration, fever, and tremors. But this? It was more subtle, more insidious, creeping through her system like a shadow that was impossible to grasp. "How are you feeling?" Julian asked one evening, his voice laced with concern as he sat next to her, reviewing his notes once again. Elira had been quiet for the last few hours, something he had noticed all too often lately. She'd lost some of her usual sharpness, a result of the parasite's invasive actions, but Julian had seen how her eyes would still flash with a sense of alertness, a silent reminder that she was holding on. Elira turned her head slightly to face him, and for the first time in days, she smiled, though it was a small, tired smile. "I'm fine," she said, though Julian knew it was a lie. The words sounded weak, and her once radiant features now appeared drawn, almost ghostly. The energy was leaving her, bit by bit, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Yet, her voice was calm when she continued. "You've done everything you could. I think I'm starting to understand. This is my fight, and you've helped me to have the strength to fight it." Julian pressed his lips together. He knew she was trying to make him feel better, trying to make him believe there was nothing more he could do, but deep inside, he couldn't accept that. He couldn't just sit there and watch someone die without trying everything, no matter how impossible it seemed. "We haven't tried everything yet," he said firmly. "I'm still working on it. There has to be a way to stop this. I'll find it. I swear I will." Elira's eyes softened as she looked at him, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of hope in her expression, a flash of trust. "You're the only one who can," she said quietly. "I know that now." But despite the trust, the words did nothing to relieve the weight in Julian's chest. The reality was that, no matter what he did, time was running out. And with each passing hour, he was left to grapple with the knowledge that they might not be able to figure it out in time. The scans Julian had been running were slowly starting to show more details. Vital signs were weakening, and the parasite's spread was undeniable. It was no longer just about her arm. It was now in her bloodstream. He had found the telltale signs in her heart rate, her respiratory rate, and in the blood tests that showed high levels of toxin. She was slipping away, slowly, despite his best efforts. And the more he worked, the more he felt like he was on the edge of a cliff, desperate not to fall, yet unable to find a way back. Every test, every bit of analysis he tried to run only seemed to confirm that there was no easy solution. With frustration mounting, Julian turned to his last resort, a request for help. He began to tap into the ship's communication system, a secure line to the Galactic Medical Network, where the greatest minds in the galaxy could provide insight into something like this. If anyone knew how to deal with a parasite of this caliber, it would be them. It wasn't much of a solution, but it was better than nothing. As he sent the transmission, Julian's thoughts drifted back to Elira. Her face had grown pale in the last few hours, her breathing labored and shallow. He didn't know what would happen if the parasite completely took over. Would she lose control? Or would it be worse than that? Would she die before they could find a solution? Then, just as the communication line was established, a new alert went off. A transmission from an unknown source. Julian's hands froze over the console. It was not just a signal, it was a distress call. He scrambled to analyze the data. His pulse quickened as he processed the message. The transmission was faint, but it was unmistakable. The source was coming from the asteroid's surface. Someone was alive down there. Dr. Foster. The voice crackled through the speaker. You need to listen closely. There's something you don't understand. The parasite. It's not just a biological organism. It's connected to something far more dangerous. Get to the surface before it's too late. The signal cut off abruptly, leaving Julian frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who had sent the message or why, but the urgency in the voice made his blood run cold. The parasite? Not just biological. What did that mean? What was the connection to the asteroid's surface? Without thinking twice, Julian grabbed his medical kit, determination filling every fiber of his being. If this was a clue, if this could lead him to the source of the parasite, he had to go. He had no other choice. And Elira, she needed him. She needed him to survive this. Chapter 4. The Final Struggle. The surface of asteroid 537 Rho was a desolate wasteland. The landscape littered with jagged rocks and craters that had been carved out by centuries of cosmic bombardment. The sky above was a dull gray, and the atmosphere or lack of it made the place feel all the more eerie, as if it had been abandoned by every living being in the universe long ago. Yet here Julian stood, at the base of an ancient, half-buried structure that seemed out of place in the otherwise barren landscape. The structure was old, older than anything humans had ever built, and it exuded an unsettling aura. Julian's mind raced as he approached it, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from a sense of impending dread. This was where the distress signal had come from, and as he descended into the ruins, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. What if the parasite wasn't just an alien organism? What if it was tied to something much larger, something that had been dormant on this very asteroid for centuries? Was the parasite's appearance tied to whatever had been buried beneath the surface? With every step he took, Julian felt the air grow colder. The metallic walls of the structure seemed to hum faintly, and the air felt thick, charged with something unseen, something alien. The entrance was partially obstructed by debris, but Julian, with years of experience in tight spots, managed to clear it quickly. The inside was dark, the only light coming from the glow of his flashlight. The walls seemed to pulse with an odd energy as though they were alive, and every step deeper into the structure seemed to bring a sense of dread that Julian couldn't shake. There, in the heart of the ruin, he found what he had been looking for. There was a chamber, ancient but still functioning, and at its center, a massive containment unit, its surfaces covered in strange symbols that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. Julian's eyes widened as he approached the chamber. He knew without a doubt that this was the source. This was where the parasite had originated, where it had been unleashed. As Julian studied the chamber, the truth began to unfold. The parasite wasn't just a biological organism. It was a weapon, a form of control, a parasite designed to infiltrate and dominate its host, designed by a long-forgotten race. The parasite wasn't random. It had been unleashed on purpose. It had been engineered to take control of sentient beings, to break them down, to strip away their autonomy, and to make them slaves. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath Julian's feet, and the lights flickered as if something had been activated deep within the ruins. The ship's communication system crackled in his ear, and he heard Elira's voice. "Dr. Foster," she said, her voice weak but urgent, "it's too late. The parasite, it's not just a disease. It's a weapon. It's reaching out. You have to destroy it before it takes me completely." Julian gripped the console tightly, panic setting in. "I know, Elira. I know. I'm trying to understand it, just hold on. I'm coming back to you." But as the structure around him began to shake more violently, Julian knew that the race for her life was far from over. The final struggle had begun, and they would have to face an enemy far older and more dangerous than either of them could have anticipated. The tremors that rattled the structure seemed to grow stronger with every passing second, and the air around Julian thickened with an unnatural energy. The ancient containment unit in front of him hummed to life, its once dormant systems now coming online, and for the first time since his arrival, Julian understood the full scale of what they were up against. This wasn't just a parasite, it was a carefully crafted weapon, designed to infiltrate, control, and destroy. The alien race that had created it had not just designed a biological weapon, they had engineered a living, breathing force of domination. Julian's mind raced as he quickly sifted through the data on the chamber's terminals, trying to piece together anything that could help him. The symbols on the walls had become clearer, their meanings suddenly more apparent. This wasn't just any laboratory. It was a place where an experiment had gone horribly wrong. This parasite had been released intentionally, perhaps as a failed weapon, left behind to fester in the dark recesses of the asteroid's hidden chambers. He glanced down at his communicator, desperately hoping for some sign from the Epsilon 7. Elira's voice crackled in his ear again, quieter this time, more strained. "Dr. Foster, you need to hurry. The parasite is moving faster than we thought. It's in my head now," she said, her voice breaking, filled with fear. "If it takes me, I dash." The signal cut out abruptly, and Julian felt his heart drop to his stomach. He didn't have much time. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let her slip through his fingers. Every moment he stood there, hesitating, the parasite was advancing deeper into Elira's body and mind, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that there might not be a cure, no miracle fix, and no easy solution. The parasite was intelligent, it was evolving. Julian snapped into action, running through his options. He had no way of containing or removing it with the limited tools and resources he had on hand, but there had to be some mechanism in this ancient chamber that could reverse the parasite's control. The lights overhead flickered wildly, and Julian's attention shifted back to the containment unit. There was a central terminal, and he made his way toward it, hoping against hope that it could give him the answers he needed. His fingers flew across the interface, scrolling through data and activating systems he couldn't fully comprehend. Then, with a sudden spark of realization, he saw it an interface designed to purge a bioorganism from the system. It was designed for the very parasite that was now ravaging Elira's body. But there was a catch. The system was set up to destroy the parasite, yes, but in doing so, it would also destroy its host. If Julian initiated the purge, it would kill Elira along with the parasite. There was no way around it. There was no cure, no way to simply remove the parasite and leave her intact. He paused, his hands trembling as they hovered over the console. The choice he faced was unbearable, but it was one that he knew he had to make. He couldn't let her become a puppet of the parasite. He couldn't let it control her. She was more than just a survivor. She was a fighter. She had come to him for help, and in return, he had to do what he could to help her survive. "Elira," he said into his communicator, his voice strained, "I'm going to initiate the purge sequence. It's the only way to stop it. You have to trust me." There was no response for several long moments, and for a brief second, Julian thought he might have lost her entirely. But then, her voice returned quiet, almost a whisper, but still strong. "I trust you," she said simply. "Do what you must." With those final words, Julian's resolve hardened. He activated the sequence. The ground shook beneath him, and the lights flickered, signaling the start of the procedure. He felt a sense of finality wash over him as the system powered up. His heart was heavy with dread, and his mind raced through every possible outcome. But there was no turning back now. The parasite had spread too far. This was the only way to ensure Elira's survival, and if she was to survive, it would be the only way to save her. The chamber's walls seemed to pulse as a low, humming noise filled the air. Julian quickly moved back to the terminal, checking the readings on the screens. The parasite's activity inside Elira's body was responding to the purge protocol, but the process was agonizingly slow. Julian watched, feeling helpless as the timer ticked down, praying that this would be enough. The humming intensified, and Julian could hear the pulse of the chamber's system working to break down the parasite's hold on Elira's body. His mind flashed through every single decision he had made, each test, each failed attempt to reverse the damage. He had spent so long trying to find another solution, but this was the only option. He had given everything, his expertise, his time, his faith in the possibility of a cure, but in the end, there was only one way forward. Then, the process suddenly accelerated, the final stages of the purge ramping up in intensity. Julian's heart leapt in his chest, and he scrambled to monitor the readings as they flashed across the screen. The parasite was being eradicated. He could see it visibly breaking down within her body, but with each second, Elira's vitals weakened. No, Julian whispered to himself, panic flooding his chest as he saw her heart rate dip dangerously low. She was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The last readings flickered on the terminal her body was failing. The parasite was gone, but so was the strength in her body. Her heart rate had slowed, and her blood pressure was plummeting. Desperation seized him. Julian raced to her side, feeling her weakening pulse. She was cold to the touch, and her breathing was shallow, labored. "No, Elira," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Stay with me, please. I can't lose you." Her eyes fluttered open, her violet gaze meeting his with a sense of clarity that took him by surprise. A faint, weak smile appeared on her face, though it was tinged with sadness. "You did it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved me, saved us both." Tears welled in Julian's eyes as he held her hand tightly, his heart racing. "I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if I could save you." "You did," she replied, her words slow and measured. "You gave me a chance. You fought for me." Julian could feel the life slowly returning to her body, though the journey to full recovery would be long. It wouldn't be easy, there would be scars, both physical and emotional, but they had both survived. The parasite was gone. Elira had survived the worst of it. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I owe you my life," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I can't stay." Julian's heart clenched in his chest. "What do you mean? Your dash?" "I must go," she said, her expression suddenly distant, the light in her eyes dimming as if the weight of the universe had settled on her shoulders once again. "The war, the parasite, it wasn't just me. There are more. The galaxy isn't safe. You've saved me, but the fight is far from over. You have to be ready." Her words hung in the air as Julian nodded solemnly. He knew that this was only the beginning. They had survived, but the war she spoke of had only begun to reach Earth's doorstep. With a final, lingering look at Julian, Elira gave a small nod, and as she slowly stood to leave, he watched her go with a heavy heart. The war was not over. The universe, vast and unknown, still had more for them both to face. But for now, they had won. And for that, Julian Foster would never stop fighting.